When I was a kid, my dream job was to become a game developer. When I discovered GameMaker when I was 12, I was glued to the computer. Programming to me was initially a means to an end, but over the years it became something that I actually started to love. Now, many years later, I had found my coding skills starting to hit a wall, and with the gaming industry in disarray, I thought maybe I should go to school to learn to code professionally, so that I can land a job in the software development industry. And so I did go back to school, but having gone back to school, I realized very quickly that all the time I spent using GameMaker's scripting language GML had actually given me a massive head start. And comparing GML to the language we were learning, Python, and seeing the learning process of my fellow students, I couldn't help but think that they might have actually had a better time learning GML as their first language as I had. Now, I get it though. Python is a great first language, and schools don't typically teach GameMaker for obvious reasons, especially in programs that aren't focused particularly on game design. It's just not practical outside of GameMaker itself. But I'm still going to make the case that students should be learning it anyway, purely because of the fundamentals that it ingrains in you. But let's go deeper into this. Here's why I think you should learn GML first. First of all, like Python, which is what we started with in school, GML is loosely typed. That means it can be pretty forgiving when you're starting out, but as you get more experienced, you can actually start to write it in a more formal, structured way. It even treats semicolons similar to JavaScript, so while you don't need them at first, you can add them for good practice. And that kind of transition prepares you really well for stricter languages like C# later on. Now, let's get into variable scope. GML's take on variable scope is a little different from other languages, but in a good way. Global variables are available across your whole project. Local variables are tied directly into the object they live in. So yes, what GameMaker calls a local variable might actually be considered a global variable in other languages, and what we'd call a temporary variable in GameMaker is what other languages would call a local variable. That might all sound a bit confusing, but that difference actually helped me understand scope and the importance of it much more clearly. Now let's talk about loops. Learning loops in GML isn't necessarily easier than in any other languages, but to me it's way more exciting. In GameMaker, when you write a loop, you actually see the result right away. Whether it's a bullet pattern, an enemy wave, or a grid of tiles, all of it happens in real time. And when it breaks, you see it break. Which, yeah, it can be terrifying, but it's also super motivating. You want to get it right because that feedback loop is immediate and visual. That made loops click for me way faster than just printing numbers in a console. Now on to functions. In school, one thing that really surprised me was how many people struggled with functions. That was wild to me because, for me, functions have just always made sense. And I realized it's because of GameMaker. I started using GameMaker when I was 12, like I said before, and I've been using it for years, so my evolution of coding happened at a very slow and steady rate. And functions were just such a fundamental part of all the tutorials I watched and the projects that I worked on that they just made sense to me. It wasn't something I had to think about. I can't say GameMaker functions are inherently easier than Python functions to learn at first. It's just the fact that I had to use them so often when making games that it made the concept just feel natural. So if functions are something that trip you up, GameMaker gives you a fun, low-pressure way to get comfortable with them. Now let's get into object-oriented programming. So this is a bit of a contentious area, but this is kind of where we get into, is GML an object-oriented language or is it not? And it's a bit of a gray area, but at the end of the day it doesn't matter because GameMaker still gets you thinking in object-oriented programming terms. For starters, you work with game objects. These objects have properties. The objects can have parent objects, they can have child objects, they can inherit or override events. You're literally writing in objects. Sure, it can be a little frustrating for more advanced developers that some properties like obj_character.x are hardwired to a screen position, which is why we use custom variables like HSP instead of hspeed. But as a beginner, it's an awesome way to start learning what properties are, and their relationship to the object, and just how they work in general. Now, I haven't fully explored more advanced OOP stuff in GML like polymorphism or encapsulation, but the point is, by the time you're ready for those, GameMaker has already given you the mental framework to understand them, which again, for me, really helped in my schooling so far. So yeah, Python is probably more universally useful, and at the end of the day, maybe it's the best language to learn, just at least from a practicality standpoint. But if you want a coding experience that's hands-on, intuitive, and actually fun, GameMaker is definitely the way to go. But what do you think? Did starting with GML give you a leg up too, or are you just beginning your coding journey and wondering where to start? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.